Hello everybody, before we dive into today's video, we're very happy to introduce one of our favorite sponsors to work with, the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts. Ever wondered where the story of America's leadership took root? Quincy is that place. This city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of President John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of America's founding fathers. You can explore the birthplaces of these iconic leaders and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourselves in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history with present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of the Thomas Crane Library and Old City Hall, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene. With an array of global and local flavors, it's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com and step into history, and create some unforgettable memories while you're at it. Now let's get into today's video. Your Majesty, Caesar, King, Emperor, Lord Protector, Excellency, Duke. These are only a handful of monikers given to leaders of nations throughout history. Picking from such official titles and honorifics to apply to one's own leader when forming a new nation would seem rather straightforward. However, in a budding nation that vehemently rejected just about anything that was associated with the old world and its forms of government, deciding what to call their leaders was anything but straightforward, and at one point brought the US Senate to a screeching halt right from their earliest sessions. This is the fascinating and mildly humorous story of how the US president got his then rather unique and extremely humble moniker amongst leaders of nations. Our story today begins on April 14th, 1789. On that day, George Washington was sitting in his home in Mount Vernon in Virginia when the Secretary of the Continental Congress, Charles Thompson, arrived bearing a letter from the US Senate that stated that Washington had won the recent election and was now leader of the nation under its new constitution. This was lucky for the asset-rich but cash-strapped former general, as he would later write his nephew, George, when giving advice on running a plantation and life in general. In this letter, he particularly advised him to remain frugal in all things and stated of his election, "Indeed, necessity, if this had not happened, would have forced me into the measure of frugality, as my means are not adequate to the expense at which I had lived since my retirement to what is called private life." That said, he also noted in this letter that becoming the nation's first president under the new constitution was something I dreaded would take place. And if you're curious here, the initial salary for the president was set at $25,000 per year, a little over $500,000 today, and the vice president was set to earn $5,000 per year. For reference, today the president has a salary of $400,000 per year, so slightly less than Washington, whereas the vice president earns $235,100, so over double the nation's first vice president in John Adams. In any event, 2 days after receiving news of his victory, Washington set out for Federal Hall in New York City, where he was inaugurated on Thursday, April 30th. 9 days after the runner-up to the election, Adams was inaugurated as vice president. Right from the start, issues of protocol bogged the Senate down with, directly before Washington's inauguration, Adams rising and stating, "Gentlemen, I wish the direction of the Senate. The president will, I suppose, address the Congress. How shall I behave? How shall we receive it? Shall it be standing or sitting?" This apparently kicked off a heated discussion on how any of them should receive the president and whether they ought to mirror how Parliament in Britain receives their king or be much less formal. According to Senator William McClay of Pennsylvania, little headway was being made when suddenly a clerk arrived from the House, triggering yet another furious debate on how to receive him. McClay states, "A silly kind of resolution of the committee on that business had been laid on the table some days ago. The amount of it was that each house should communicate to the other what and how they chose. It concluded, however, something in this way, that everything should be done with all propriety that was proper. The question now was, shall this be adopted, that we may know how to receive the clerk? Mr. Lee brought the House of Commons before us again. He reprobated the rule, declared that the clerk should not come within, that the proper mode was for the sergeant-at-arms with the mace on his shoulder to meet the clerk at the door and receive his communication. We are not, however, provided for this ceremonious way of doing business, having neither a mace nor a sergeant." Continuing to debate the matter at length with the clerk left waiting, things came to a head when yet more officials arrived and yet more debate was had on how the Senate should receive them. Ultimately, the president himself arrived with seemingly little headway made on any of it. While this may all seem quite ridiculous, all involved were extremely well aware that every little thing they did was setting a precedent that could have major implications, not just down the road, but potentially immediately, as with the president's title, which we'll get to shortly. But in brief for now, many in the nation already saw such a position as tantamount to just a king with another name, and countless news reports at the time even rumored some were considering that another revolution was needed to get rid of any such monarch and overly powerful central government. Even outside the nation, foreign powers were also derisive in making such a connection, as William V, Prince of Orange, for example, would write to John Adams, "Sir, you have given yourself a king under the title of president." Washington himself would write to James Madison of his own conduct and concerns with all of this. "As the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents be fixed on true principles." And speaking of Madison, he would write to Thomas Jefferson on June the 30th, 1789, concerning trying to figure all of this out. "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." Not just with matters of how to receive officials and titles, but of setting up everything from the judiciary system to the banks, from immigration laws to militia acts, right down to whether the nation should have a standing army or not, let alone the entire etiquette and protocol of everything involved. They were largely starting from scratch on much of it, using the minimalist and rather revolutionary Constitution as their guiding document, and generally vehemently rejecting the way things were done before by other governments, in many cases simply because the other governments were doing it that way and they didn't want to be associated with such. As for the president's subsequent inaugural address in the Senate chamber after taking his oath of office, while today the general perception of Washington is of a regal bearing and the picture of a powerful, confident, dignified leader, McClay claims Washington was anything but during his inaugural speech, noting this great man was agitated and embarrassed more than ever he was by the leveled cannon or pointed musket. He trembled and several times could scarce make out to read, though it must be supposed he had often read it before. When he came to the words, "all the world," he made a flourish with his right hand which left rather an ungainly impression. Afterwards, Adams chose to officially refer to this inaugural address as the president's most gracious speech, referencing the British way to refer to certain speeches of the king, such as King George III's address to Parliament back in 1775 discussing the rebellious colonists. In this one, King George, among other things, noted, "When the unhappy and deluded multitude shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy, as if such provinces or colony had never revolted." Washington himself, in a letter to one Colonel Joseph Reed a few months later, would use the most gracious speech moniker for the kingly address, writing, "We are at length favored with the sight of His Majesty's most gracious speech, breathing sentiments of tenderness and compassion for his deluded American subjects." Adams simply wanted to apply the same such pomp and sense of grandeur to Washington's own address, even if it was apparently awkwardly delivered with some amount of anxiety. McClay's response to this most gracious speech suggestion, however, was not just to reject it, but he states, "I looked all around the Senate, every countenance seemed to wear a blank. The secretary was going on, I must speak or nobody would. Mr. President," referring to Adams, "we have lately had a hard struggle for our liberty against kingly authority. The minds of men are still heated. Everything related to that species of government is odious to the people. The words prefixed to the president's speech are the same that are usually placed before the speech of His Britannic Majesty. I know they will give offense. I consider them as improper. I therefore move that it be struck out and that it stand simply address or speech, as may be judged most suitable." And that the enemies of the Constitution had objected to it, the facility there would be of transition from it to kingly government and all the trappings and splendor of royalty. If such a thing as this appeared on our minutes, they would not fail to represent it as the first step of the ladder in the ascent to royalty. Adams, in turn, responded, according to McClay, who noteworthy here loathed Adams, as we'll get into shortly, he was for a dignified and respectable government, and as far as he knew, the sentiments of the people they thought as he did. After some debate, it was decided to get rid of any grandiose name for such presidential speeches. This all now brings us, finally, to the title of president itself. After Washington took his oath of office, in which he vowed to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God, the Chancellor of New York, Robert Livingston, shouted to the gathered crowd, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." While perhaps lost on people today, at the time, this was a rather humble title, with president more akin to chairman or foreman, and otherwise generally up to this point used commonly for much lesser positions in all walks of life. On this note, the word president ultimately comes from the Latin praesidere, meaning to sit before or to preside over, hence a presiding officer sitting over some group. This gave rise to the Old French president, meaning presiding over or leader, and in turn borrowed in Middle English for the title for heads of institutions from almshouses to hospitals to religious houses to universities to banks to various trade groups, with, for example, one of the earliest examples in English being at Cambridge in 1464, where the head of Magdalen College at Cambridge was given the title of master and his second the title of president. Noteworthy here, Henry Dunster, the first titled president of Harvard, was a student at Magdalen, and it's been hypothesized that he chose the term president at Harvard rather than master, as his predecessor had from this, and to illustrate a level of humility in the position by choosing the lesser title. Whatever the case there, it would be in America that the title would begin to be elevated in this way to a role far higher in the power food chain than it typically was in the Old World. This rise began with president being used as the title for the heads of certain colonies, such as Virginia, and later during the Revolution, the title for the heads of states such as Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Hampshire, before governor became the de facto for all states. From here, president was elevated further to the title for the chairman of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Important to note here, this position was not anywhere close to that given to George Washington and those after him under the new Constitution, in particular because Congress itself oversaw all the functions that individual executed. The president at this time was, as alluded to in his full title, just the chairman of a sort of that committee. Hence the name president was rather fitting given its then normal usage. Borrowing from the previous articles, the new Constitution in Article 2 likewise gave the simple title of President to the nation's new leader when referenced throughout, and his runner-up, Vice President, in both cases again a rather lowly term and seemingly chosen exactly for this reason, to be simple and unassuming, as the group of traitors to king and country weren't exactly keen on elevating any one individual too much over them. While the new president would have significantly more power than the old, names have implications, and anything too grandiose would not be seen in a positive light by many in the nation. And indeed, as alluded to, given the power the president was being granted, many were already claiming the new supposed republic was really just a monarchy given new clothes. There was a potential problem with this mindset, however, when it came to a simple title, and that is how other nations of the world would perceive the new leader of the executive branch, especially with such a humble title compared to their own. America's little experiment in their revolutionary form of government was already generally seen with extreme skepticism and derision in many countries of the world. Thus some, most notably Vice President John Adams, felt titles on the same level as those given to leaders of the old world would help garner more respect in their eyes. He stated of this, "There are presidents of fire companies and cricket clubs, and even something like Excellency wouldn't do, as then the person in the office would be leveled with colonial governors or with functionaries from German princedoms." This perception, in turn, could lead to a weakening of the office at a time when the role was first being defined. Something greater was needed, at least according to Adams and his supporters. A couple key points to understand in this is, first, how important titles were back then and even to Washington himself. In fact, a little over a decade before, in 1776, General Washington, at a critical time in the early going of the Revolution, directly after the British landed with a massive force fully capable of crushing his army, refused to accept a letter from the commander of the British forces attempting a peaceful resolution before any bloodshed, merely because said commander, Admiral Richard Howe, had addressed the letter George Washington, Esquire, not acknowledging Washington's relatively new rank and position. After consulting with his officers over the slight, Washington refused to receive the letter. Instead, one Joseph Reed simply replied to the British Lieutenant Philip Brown, who was delivering the letter, that there was no one in the Continental Army that answered to that address. Rather than commence battle, Howe tried at a compromise, but still couldn't give in for reasons we'll get into shortly in an exchange between Howe and Ben Franklin and John Adams. But for now, Howe sent the letter again, this time to George Washington, Esquire, etc., etc. But this too was refused. Not getting anywhere with letters owing to the issue of title on the letter, Howe attempted a different tack, asking via one Captain Nisbet Balfour if Washington would instead be willing to meet with one of his representatives, Colonel James Patterson, in person to discuss things that way. Washington agreed and a meeting was set. However, upon learning from Colonel Patterson at the meeting that Howe had only been granted the power to offer pardons in negotiation for peace, Washington famously replied, "Those who have committed no fault want no pardon." And it was on. Going back to Washington's presidency, it was also noted by some that the title of president here actually was a major downgrade for Washington given his former title of general, and often referred to as Your Excellency while he was commander of the American forces during the Revolution. In another such instance illustrating the importance of titles, not long after Howe's exchange with Washington, the British sued for peace and John Adams, Ben Franklin, and their third wheel, Edward Rutledge, went to meet with Howe. Among the first things they discussed right off the bat after dinner when formal talks would commence was their titles. Without a resolution of such, no talks could commence. Howe stated of all of this that he had no power to consider the colonies independent as they had declared themselves when he was en route, and thus he could not even acknowledge them as such on their formal titles and positions. And if they objected on this point and insisted he use their titles, there was no point in proceeding any further with peace talks. He instead proposed he could otherwise consider them gentlemen of great ability and influence in the country, and that for his part he also considered them British subjects. The extremely laid-back Ben Franklin had no problem with this, noting his lordship might consider the gentlemen present in any view he thought proper, that they were also at liberty to consider themselves in their real character, that there was no necessity on this occasion to distinguish between the Congress and individuals, and that the conversation might be held as amongst friends. On the other side, Adams would more abrasively state, "Your lordship may consider me in what light you please, except that of a British subject." Going back to Washington and his title, after his inauguration, the Gazette and Daily Advertiser would both refer to the president as His Excellency and President. But the Senate needed to figure out more officially if any title beyond president was warranted. On the two sides of this argument were James Madison and the House as a whole, and within the Senate, William McClay and supporters advocating for no additional titles for the president. And on the other side, as noted, Vice President John Adams and his supporters who felt it critical that the president needed a better title. As for Madison, as a brief aside, it's noteworthy that he is actually thought to have been the principal author of Washington's inaugural address, which comprised a rather short 1,419 words. In contrast, his original draft was over 70 rather meandering and rambling pages, which Madison stated he found a rather strange production when he read it. In the end, Madison is thought to have rewritten the thing, keeping the essence but significantly more concise and well organized. In any event, on the matter of titles, Madison at one point had also thought the president needed a better honorific, initially suggesting his elective Majesty, keeping some of the pomp but noting this person was elected, not given the position by some birthright. However, he would later recant this stance and led the charge with the House on convincing them no additional monikers were needed, which was critical to the whole thing being shot down. Madison would state of this, "I am not afraid of titles because I fear the danger of any power they could confer, but I am against them because they are not very reconcilable with the nature of our government or the genius of the people, even if they were proper in themselves. They are not so at this juncture of time, but my strongest objection is founded in principle. Instead of increasing, they diminish the true dignity and importance of a republic, and would, in particular, on this occasion, diminish the true dignity of the first magistrate himself. If we give titles, we must either borrow or invent them. If we have recourse to the fertile fields of luxuriant fancy and deck out an airy being of our own creation, it is a great chance, but its fantastic properties renders the empty phantom ridiculous and absurd. If we borrow, the servile imitation will be odious, not to say ridiculous also. We must copy from the pompous sovereigns of the East or follow the inferior potentates of Europe. In either case, the splendid tinsel or gorgeous robe would disgrace the manly shoulders of our chief. The more truly honorable shall we be by showing a total neglect and disregard to things of this nature. The more simple, the more republican we are in our manners, the more rational dignity we acquire." Nevertheless, despite the House's objection, the Senate, perhaps not coincidentally meant to be representative of the more aristocratic class, soldiered on in search of a more esteemed title. Various honorifics within the Senate were proposed, such as His Mightiness, His Most Benign Highness, His Most Serene Highness, His High Mightiness, before ultimately, according to McClay, the Senate settled on His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Noteworthy here, Adams preferred the slight tweak of this, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties. Before we go further into the upcoming mildly humorous and heated debate, it's important to understand a few key things about the leaders of the two sides of the argument in the Senate. On the one hand, Vice President John Adams, being John Adams, was constitutionally incapable of keeping his mouth shut when he had an opinion, especially given that at the time, so much was so critical to the young nation, perhaps even surviving at all. I mean, you might as well ask Adams to stop breathing as to stop giving his unabashed opinion, no matter what anyone else thought. And given the enormous brain that resided in his skull, he was remarkably adept at getting people to listen. As founding father Benjamin Rush would state of Adams, he saw the whole of a subject at a single glance, and by a happy union of the powers of reasoning and persuasion, often succeeded in carrying measures which were, at first sight, of an unpopular nature. Yet Adams really shouldn't have had any say here. You see, the vice president had no real defined role outside of a tiebreaker in the Senate, as well as to simply exist in case anything happened to the president. Another blow to the man on this front was that Washington, especially in the first term, seemed to have little interest in including Adams in anything he was doing or really get his thoughts on much, though this did slightly change later, such as in 1795, a year before Adams himself would become president, with Adams helping to convince Washington to support the rather controversial Jay Treaty between Britain and the United States. Adams would write his wife Abigail of this position as vice president, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." However, as everything was brand new for the country and the Constitution had very purposefully been a minimal document, not trying to handle everything, but just put forth a general set of guidelines and principles for the nation, Adams decided from the start to try to expand his constitutional role in the Senate via inserting himself in their debates and even trying to lead them. This was something that rubbed a lot of senators the wrong way, owing to a member of the executive branch essentially trying to lead and directly influence a body of the legislative branch. Going back to titles and the importance of them, Adams' eventual choice to sign legislative documents as John Adams, Vice President of the United States, was also seen as a major faux pas by some for this reason, owing to it only noting his role in the executive branch. In response to this, Adams would take to signing such documents more or less, giving himself separate titles for both John Adams, Vice President of the United States, and President of the Senate. Ultimately, the Senate finally made peace with Adams in the form of making it so the Senate deliberations would not include the Vice President anymore. A rather major blow for a man of his stature and intellect, but at least Adams did get to cast more tie-breaking votes within the Senate at 31 than any other vice president since. This was largely owing to the Senate at the time being evenly split between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But before they managed to muzzle the unmuzzleable, there was the matter of how to address the president in the Senate's response letter to the president. This brings us to the lead of the other side of the argument within the Senate. Much of what we know of this discussion, and indeed the detailed internal discussions of the Senate for the next couple years, comes from the aforementioned Senator William McClay's daily journal, which more or less violated the inviolable secrecy the Senate at the time was partially operating under until 1795, when Senate sessions were no longer closed to the public. An important thing to point out here was that McClay was, shall we say, seemingly a bit biased, to put it mildly, and this may have affected the way he colored discussions at times. In particular, when reading through his accounts, not just on this, but other such debates, McClay seems to have a tendency to write his own thoughts and arguments extremely eloquently, but paint his opponents as more than a little absurd, and their arguments often extremely poorly worded. This is perhaps no better illustrated than when it came to the likes of John Adams, who McClay, as noted, loathed, with McClay's accounts very frequently and sometimes explicitly painting Adams and his arguments as seemingly come from a bumbling buffoon, which was in stark contrast to how most of the rest of his contemporaries described the man. Yes, a man with little social grace, extremely abrasive, occasionally with seemingly no ability or caring to read the room. If Adams thought something was right and the entire world thought he was wrong, he'd stubbornly stick to his principles and then do his best to change everyone's mind. The epitome of Captain America's little speech in Amazing Spider-Man number 537. If Adams felt something was right, to quote the captain, it doesn't matter what the press says, it doesn't matter what the politicians or mobs say, it doesn't matter if the whole country decides that something wrong is something right. This nation was founded on one principle above all else, the requirement that we stand up for what we believe, no matter the odds or the consequences. When the mob and the press and the whole world tell you to move, your job is to plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you move. This element of Adams' character was perhaps no better illustrated than in his choice to defend the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, despite even his own extreme opposition to the British, ultimately being one of the leading patriots of the Revolution. In the end, he just felt everyone deserved a fair and just trial no matter what, and he wanted to make sure the soldiers involved got that in a proper defense, even if it cost him his career and reputation. As Adams would later write to his wife on this, "I have consented to my own ruin, to your ruin, and to the ruin of our children. But the law will not bend to the uncertain wishes, imaginations, and wanton tempers of men." Thus, while yes, sometimes as abrasive as it is possible to be, and note we'll get into this more in the bonus facts with a sample of Adams' rather legendary scathing insults to his contemporaries, and could at times seem a little ridiculous to his peers, he was nonetheless insanely well respected, and his intellect and skill in debate were considered among the best in the nation at the time. Yet that's not even close to how McClay portrays Adams or his arguments pretty much anywhere in his journal. McClay was also, much like Adams himself, certainly not shy of giving his very frank opinion of most of his fellow senators and on anything at all, noting most of them were a set of vipers who cared for nothing else but the creation of a new monarchy in America. He also felt the US Constitution would turn out to be the vilest of all traps that was ever set to ensnare the freedom of an unsuspecting people. As for Adams specifically, McClay became one of his most bitter political detractors for a number of reasons, ranging from Adams' choice to not support moving the capital to Philadelphia, rather what would become Washington, D.C., to Adams' push to expand the powers of the federal government, to Adams seemingly overstepping trying to lead the Senate in the first place. This list goes on and on with regards to the countless clashes between the two. This all resulted in McClay writing many rather scathing accounts of Adams. For just a few samples, McClay wrote on May the 2nd, 1789, "Adams, not well furnished with small talk more than myself, and has a very silly kind of laugh. I have often looked with the utmost attention at him to see if his aspect, air, etc. could inspire me with an opinion of his being a man of genius. But no, the thing seems impossible." In a dinner with Adams and others on March the 4th, he stated, "I looked often around the company to find the happiest of faces. The president seemed to bear in his countenance a subtle aspect of melancholy. No cheering ray of convivial sunshine broke through the cloudy gloom of settled seriousness. At every interval of eating or drinking, he played on the table with a fork or knife like a drumstick. Next to him, on his right, sat bonny Johnny Adams, ever and anon mantling his visage with the most unmeaning simper that ever dimpled the face of folly." Later, on May the 11th, he writes, "Adams takes on him to school the members from the chair. Instead of that sedate, easy air which I would have him possess, he will look on one side, then on the other, then down on his knees of his breeches, then dimple his visage with the most silly kind of half-smile which I cannot well express in English. The Scotch-Irish have a word that hits it exactly, smudging. God forgive me for the vile thought, but I cannot help thinking of a monkey just put in breeches when I saw him betray such evident marks of self-conceit." Not holding back, on June 22nd, he writes, "His pride, obstinacy, and folly are equal to his vanity, and although it is a common observation that fools are the tools of knaves, yet John Adams has served to illustrate 2 points at least with me, that a fool is the most unmanageable of all brutes, and that flattery is the most irksome of all service." In yet another account on September the 18th, he writes, "Ye gods, with what indignation do I review the late attempt of some creatures among us to revive the vile machinery of royalty and nobility. O John Adams, what a wretch art thou!" On March the 2nd, 1790, he goes on, "Our vice president goes every day to the House of Representatives, and the members spend their time in lampooning him before his face." In another one on June 8th, he states, "John Adams has neither judgment, firmness of mind, nor respectability of deportment to fill the chair of such an assembly." This all finally brings us to the specific debate over the president's title. McClay writes on May the 8th, 1789, Ellsworth was enumerating how common the appellation of president was. The president, Adams, put him in mind that there were presidents of fire companies and of cricket club. Mr. Lee, at another time, was saying he believed that some of the states authorized titles for their constitution. The president, Adams, from the chair, told him that Connecticut did. At sundry other times, he interfered in a like manner. Excellency was moved for as a title by Mr. Izard. It was withdrawn by Mr. Izard, and Highness, with some prefatory word, proposed by Mr. Lee. Now, long harangues were made in favor of this title. It was insisted that such a dignified title would add greatly to the weight and authority of the government, both at home and abroad. I declare myself totally of a different opinion, that at present it was impossible to add to the respect entertained for General Washington. If you gave him the title of any foreign prince or potentate, a belief would follow that the manners of that prince and his modes of government would be adopted by the president. Mr. Lee had just before I got up read over a list of titles of all the princes and potentates of the earth, marking where the word highness occurred. The Grand Turk had it, all the princes of Germany had it, the sons and daughters of crowned heads, etc. That particular elective highness would have a most ungrateful sound to many thousands of industrious citizens who had fled from German oppression. Highness was part of the title of a prince or princes of the blood, and was often given to dukes. It was degrading our president to place him on par with any prince of any blood in Europe, nor was there one of them that could enter the lists of true glory with him. This whole silly business is the work of Mr. Adams and Mr. Lee. Izard follows Lee, and the New England men, who always herd together, follow Mr. Adams. Mr. Thompson says this used to be the case in the old Congress. Speaking of Adams, he states Adam rose and addressed the Senate for quite some time on the matter, with the specific part of Adams's speech McClay recounts being, "Gentlemen, I must tell you that it is you and the president that have the making of titles. Suppose the president to have the appointment of Mr. Jefferson's at the court of France. Mr. Jefferson is, in virtue of that appointment, the most illustrious, the most powerful, but the president himself must be something that includes all the dignitaries of the diplomatic corps, and something greater still. What will the common people of foreign countries, what will the sailors and soldiers say? George Washington, President of the United States, they will despise him. This is all nonsense to the philosopher, but so is all government, whatever." After Adams's speech, McClay claims he responded quite a bit more eloquently. "Let us read the Constitution. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. The Constitution goes further. The servants of the public are prohibited from accepting them from any foreign state, king, or prince, so that the appellations and terms given to nobility in the Old World are contraband language in the United States, nor can we apply them to our citizens consistent with the Constitution. As to what the common people, soldiers, and sailors of foreign countries may think of us, I do not think it imports us much. Perhaps the less they think, or have occasion to think of us, the better. From the English, indeed, we may borrow terms that would not be wholly unintelligible to our own citizens, but will they thank us for the compliment? Would not the plagiarism be more likely to be attended with contempt than respect among all of them? It has been admitted that all this is nonsense to the philosopher. I am ready to admit that every high-sounding, pompous appellation descriptive of qualities which the object does not possess must appear bombastic nonsense in the eye of every wise man. In the end, as any good governing body should in all matters, after a good lengthy debate making sure to maximally take up as much of their precious time in it as possible, the Senate decided to table the matter and let someone else decide. McClay writes of this, "The Senate have been induced to be of the opinion that it would be proper to annex a respectable title for the office of President of the United States, but the Senate desires of preserving harmony with the House of Representatives, where the practice lately observed in presenting an address to the President was without the addition of title. Think it proper for the President to act in conformity with the practice of the House. Therefore resolved that the present address be to the President of the United States without addition of title." After that happy conclusion that went McClay, James Madison, and the House's way, Madison would write of this to Thomas Jefferson, "It will not have escaped you that it was addressed with the truly Republican simplicity to George Washington, President of the United States." As for Jefferson, he would ring in on the Senate's former preferred, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same, on July the 29th, 1789, stating, "The President's title as proposed by the Senate was the most superlative, ridiculous thing I ever heard of. It is a proof the more of the justice of the character given by Dr. Franklin of my friend John Adams. Always an honest man, often a great one, but sometimes absolutely mad." Noteworthy in a December the 5th, 1811 letter to one Benjamin Russ, which would precipitate Adams and Jefferson laying aside their differences and once again becoming the closest of friends, Jefferson would state he would change a single word only in Dr. Franklin's character of Adams. "I knew him to be always an honest man, often a great one, but sometimes incorrect and precipitate in his judgments." As for Washington himself, as noted, exceedingly aware that everything he did or said during his time in office would set the tone for the office for all who followed him, he likewise apparently was pleased with the simple title of the President of the United States. And that's a tradition that has stuck to this day. While the idea of president being a humble term for a leader may be lost on most in modern times, given how many nations since have adopted it for their leaders, starting with the US, then after Haiti in 1807, and spreading to dozens of other nations since, other remnants of the simplicity of the title have endured, such as with the simple Mr. President, or Mr. Secretary, or Mr. Senator, or just using these officials' names being the norm. This tradition has also bled over to countless official positions of the state in the United States, with the exception in some cases of the word honorable, occasionally used to describe an individual outside of their official title. And as for honorable, at the time this was a fairly lowly term generally used in cases like the youngest sons of noblemen, with family rank being used by the eldest sons. As for Adams, his arguments for a fancier title for the president would earn him the rather dubious unofficial title of His Rotundity the Duke of Braintree. This also bolstered the argument of his alleged love of monarchs, which would dog him throughout the rest of his political career, despite the man himself being one of the key architects of the revolution throwing off the monarchy, along with authoring, among other things, the defense of the Constitution of the United States, which not only helped define the US Constitution, but was also very explicitly in the title meant to defend the new form of government against its monarchical detractors. As author of John Adams' Republic, the One, the Few, the Many, Richard Allen Ryerson states of the confusion here, Adams viewed the elite and wealthy of the United States as little different than the aristocracy of the Old World, not based on bloodline in this case, but finances. Further, it was probably not lost on Adams that most of the leaders of the Revolution were not from among the oppressed, but rather were that very wealthy form of aristocracy in the United States, simply throwing off their rivals abroad. And indeed, some of them even wealthier than many of the royalty they sought to cast off. As historian and Pulitzer Prize winner Gordon Wood notes, the social conditions that generally are supposed to lie behind all revolutions, poverty and economic deprivation, were not present in the colonial America. There should no longer be any doubt about it. The white American colonists were not an oppressed people. They had no crushing imperial chains to throw off. Thus, denying the American aristocracy's existence was not only pointless in Adams's opinion, but counterproductive to the nation and its future. Somewhat controversial to some, Adams also viewed this class of individuals as an essential part of any society, and one that could never be gotten rid of even if people wanted to. Thus, instead of removing them, they needed to be controlled to an extent, essentially taking what such elite could offer in a positive way to society, while severely restricting their power in any way possible to get around the downside of them, as more fully outlined in our video, The Key to Humans Humaning. As Ryerson goes on, the central objective of government for Adams was always the security and happiness of the whole society, including its weakest members. The only solution to living with aristocracy, therefore, was to control it. He would devote much of the next decade to exploring how this could be done in a Republican culture. However, this stance, and particular terms Adams used in his various writings when referring to the elite class, combined with his apparent support of things like incredibly pompous-sounding titles for the president, all saw Adams painted by some as elitist, similar to his son, fellow future president John Quincy, after him. Ironically in all of this, and especially given John Adams' stance on many things surrounding the role of president in the early going, when it came to pomp and circumstance in his own life, Adams, much like his son, seemingly abhorred such things, with Adams writing in his journal on June 30th, 1770, "Formalities and ceremonies are an abomination in my sight. I hate them in religion, government, science, life." John Quincy would go even further on this front than his father. For example, in the 1856 work, Recollections of a Lifetime by Samuel Griswold Goodrich, he quotes an unknown author about what one could expect if invited to meet John Quincy Adams in the White House. He sees a little man writing at a table, nearly bald, with a face quite formal and destitute of expression, his eyes running with water, his slippers down at the heel, his fingers stained with ink, in summer wearing a striped sea-sucker coat and white trousers and dirty waistcoat spotted with ink, his whole dress altogether not worth a couple of pounds, or in a colder season, habitated by a plain blue coat, much the worse for wear, and other garments in proportion. This person, whom the ambassador mistakes for a clerk in a department, and only wonders in looking at him that the president should permit a man to appear before him in such dress, proves to be the President of the United States himself. And in further stark contrast to the public perception by some, John Quincy, like his father, was, in some respects, a quite simple man who, for example, often ate plain crackers for meals instead of fancier dinners, and who one of his favorite activities was to sit at home by himself and study his Bible, things which contrasted sharply with the elitist, corrupt, aristocratic professor version of John Quincy Adams that supporters of his political opponents pushed. Given this, the person who knew him best, his wife Louisa, lamented, "If he would only lend himself a little to the usages and manners of the people without hiding himself and rejecting their civilities, no man could be more popular because his manners are simple, unostentatious, and unassuming." And for more on all this, see our video, The Horribly Dressed, Socially Awkward Genius President. But going back to John Adams, as ever, neither the news outlets nor political rivals have ever really cared about accuracy in public political discourse. But while in this case, John Adams' suggestion on rather pompous and silly titles for the American elite may have been ridiculous, as Jefferson had stated, in the end, as with his contributions to certain revolutions, Adams would write of in an August 18, 1811 letter, "Have I not been employed in mischief all my days? Did not the American Revolution produce the French Revolution? And did not the French Revolution produce all the calamities and desolations to the human race and the whole globe ever since?" Adams nonetheless concludes that thought with what he might have also said about his opinion about the ridiculous titles for the president he had once so ardently advocated for. I meant well, however. And now how about a bonus fact? Speaking of titles and John Adams' habit of never being able to keep his mouth shut when he had an opinion about something, or someone, he was also legendary for his scathing and unapologetically frank insults. For example, in a letter to fellow founding father Benjamin Rush, Adams stated after Washington's death that Washington was not a scholar is certain, that he was too illiterate, unlearned, unread for his station, and reputation is equally past dispute. To be fair on this one, Washington himself would lament his failings as a general during the Revolution, and his reputation for indecision and seemingly not knowing what to do at critical moments of battle has often been pointed out. Adams would also note that so many of the so-called talents attributed to Washington by the masses had more to do mostly with his looks and things outside of Washington's control than much of actual substance to the man, stating, "Talents? You will say, what talents? I answer, number 1, a handsome face, that this is a talent I can prove by the authority of 1,000 instances in all ages. Number 2, a tall stature, like the Hebrew sovereign chosen because he was taller by the head than the other Jews. Number 3, an elegant form. Number 4, graceful attitudes and movement. Number 5, a large imposing fortune consisting of a great landed estate left him by his father and brother, besides a large jointure with his lady and the guardianship of the heirs of the great Custis estate, and in addition to all of this, immense tracts of land of his own acquisition. There is nothing except bloody battles and splendid victories to which mankind bow down with more reverence than to great fortune. Number 6, Washington was a Virginian. This is equivalent to 5 talents. Virginian geese are all swans. Not a burn in Scotland is more national, not a lad upon the highlands is more clannish than every Virginian I have ever known. They trumpet one another with the most pompous and mendacious pennygricks. Number 7, Washington was preceded by favorable anecdotes. The English had used him ill in the expedition at Braddock. They had not done justice to his bravery and good counsel. They had exaggerated and misrepresented his defeat and capitulation, which interested the pride as well as compassion of Americans in his favor. Number 8, he possessed the gift of silence. This I esteem as one of the most precious talents. Number 9, he had great self-command. It cost him a great exertion sometimes and a constant constraint, but to preserve so much equanimity as he did required a great capacity. Number 10, whenever he lost his temper, as he did sometimes, either love or fear in those about him induced them to conceal his weakness from the world. Here you see I have made out 10 talents without saying a word about reading, thinking, or writing. As for Adams' one-time extremely close friend Thomas Jefferson, he stated, his soul is poisoned with ambition. Jefferson had his own thoughts on Adams, however, writing on March the 4th, 1797, Adams is distrustful, obstinate, excessively vain, and takes no counsel from anyone. As noted in our videos, America's Greatest Odd Couple, covering Adams and Jefferson's strange and insanely close relationship, as well as our video America's First Power Couple, covering the story of John and Abigail Adams, Jefferson was wrong here on the last point. Adams relied on Abigail's equally keen intellect and well-read mind on pretty much all matters when it came to looking for counsel from others, with, shortly after becoming president, Adams even desperately writing to his wife some 400 miles away in Quincy, "I never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life, and I can do nothing without you. Public affairs are so critical and dangerous that all our thoughts must be taken up with them. I must entreat you to lose not a moment's time in preparing to come assist me with your counsels." Going back to insults, Adams would say of Thomas Paine's famous common sense, "What a poor, ignorant, malicious, crapulous mass." As for Alexander Hamilton, Adams stated that bastard brat of a Scottish peddler, his ambition, his restlessness, and all his grandiose schemes come, I'm convinced, from a superabundance of secretions which he couldn't find enough whores to absorb. In another case, one General John Sullivan was captured by the British and was ultimately released to deliver a message to the Continental Congress about Admiral Howe's desire for a peace conference. While Sullivan was delivering this offer and advocating for it, fellow founding father Benjamin Rush would state Adams whispered to me a wish that the first ball that had been fired on the day of the defeat of our army had gone through Sullivan's head. Going back to the rather hilarious Ben Franklin, after Adams became frustrated with Franklin's propensity to party all night and hang out with every Frenchwoman that came a-knockin' to meet the world-famous Franklin, Adams would write, "His whole life has been one continued insult to good manners and decency. These things, however, are not the worst of his faults. They show, however, the character of the man, in what contempt he holds the opinions of the world, and with what haughtiness he is capable of preserving through life in a gross and odious system of falsehood and imposture. It would be folly to deny that he has had a great genius, and that he has written several things in philosophy and in politics profoundly, but his philosophy and his politics have been infinitely exaggerated by the studied arts of empiricism, until his reputation has become one of the grossest impostures that has ever been practiced upon mankind since the days of Mahomet. So that I am persuaded he will remain as long as he lives the demon of discord among our ministers and the curse and the scourge of our foreign affairs." And not just restricting himself to people or famous works, as for the city of Philadelphia, he wrote, "Philadelphia, with all its trade and wealth and regularity, is not Boston. The morals of our people are much better, their manners are more polite and agreeable. Our language is better, our taste is better, our persons are handsomer, our spirit is greater, our laws are wiser, our religion is better, our education is better. We exceed them in everything but in a market." Not just with matters of how to receive officials and titles, but of setting up everything from the Not just with matters of how to receive officials and titles, but of setting up everything from the judiciary system to the banks, from immigration laws to militia. Not just with matters of how to receive officials and titles, but of setting up everything from the judiciary. Not just with matters of how to receive officials and titles, but of setting up everything from the